Okay, so in this lecture, this is the fourth lecture on chapters, the end of 4, chapter 5, and chapter 6, about the first 3 years of life. But in this lecture, I'm going to talk specifically about some of the basics, some of the broad stroke stuff about language development and some of the theories behind it. First off, research, and there's lots of terms in your textbook, and it breaks down different parts of speech and a lot of stuff. But I want to kind of focus on some of the bigger stuff. But it's important to point out that language is, so we talk about language as it develops in stages, right? The first thing that children do, babies do, is they learn to vocalize through crying. Then they start to make sounds, and the thinking is these are like just utterances. Eventually, they develop the cognitive understanding of gestures, so they point at things. Then we move into when we put words together. So there's a discussion in your textbook about what's called conventional social gestures. And these are like hello, bye-bye, yes, and no, that they've all learned through the process of interaction. And then they move into what's called representative gestures. And that's handing like their parents the empty cup as a symbol that they want it filled, or doing like this, that they want to be picked up. But these are not yet considered, obviously, language, right? They're communication, but they're not language. Then we move into some first words. We start saying first words, and there's what's called linguistic speech. Those are the words that we use. But when we just use very basic words, those are holo phrases, H-O-L-O phrases. We still haven't gotten into sentences. What's really interesting about the research on language development is that the linguists who study this kind of stuff, they observe that all the world over, children learn language in the same sequence. Like they learn nouns or nouns and verbs before they learn all the prepositions that sort of go in between it. We learn how to express utterances and gestures before we begin to put sentences together. And this leads to, right there, so your phonology, these parts of speech right here, that we learn them in the same sequence. One theory of this is, so you've got learning theory, which argues that we learn through interaction, right? That would be Skinner's theory. But the more accepted theory is Chomsky. And Chomsky's he's a very well-written dude. He pretty much writes about everything, seems to know everything. But his theory is what's called nativist language. And he argues that there is actually a part of our brain. He kind of uses this computer analogy, but there's a part of our brain that he refers to as the language acquisition device, and it's universal in all people, and that language is an innate part of who we are as humans. Right? So this is interesting because some of the biologists and some of the biological anthropologists and some of the evolutionary psychologists often come back to the phenomena of language as something that makes us human. And what is it about humans' language that is distinctive from the methods of communication that other animals use, right? So according to this nativist theory, right, this theory says that we are born to communicate. We are born to communicate, and that all the world over, the process of learning language is the same. And that, he says, speaks to this universal phenomena, right? This universal brain structure that is inherent in humans, that it is just part of our biological programming. Some of the things that promote or influence our development of language, if it happens naturally or normally, or if it's delayed, right? Or if we ever learn to communicate, ever learn to speak at all. Well, first of all, we need the brain structures. We need the brain structures, oh, no, that's in psychology. It's the left hemisphere, the left, language, logic. And you have to have the vocal cords. You have to have the physiological, the part of your body that makes sound, right? You also have to be, so one theory, of course, and part of this is we learn pre-language, right? But through interaction, that it's a, what's it called? It's called a serve and return. That actually refers to child neglect. But the idea that we learn that sounds are a way to communicate by people communicating with us, right? So I always think of the cats here, and some of the research on cats says that cats only meow to humans. The cats don't meow to each other. Well, I have seen my cats meow at each other, but it is in fact more of an aggressive kind of interaction, right? They hiss or they swat. But yeah, the cat will come up to me and start meowing, right? Well, that's what it hears me do. And when I communicate with it, I use vocalizations as a way of communication because I don't have a tail, you know, that gets all. Okay, moving right along. So some of the other influences, of course, are the parents, the language that the parents use. Here's some important words right here. Someone in one of my students' responses, they made reference to how they switch between English and Spanish. Well, that's what's called code switching. There's actually a textbook term for that. And people who have grown up in a home and can think and speak in two languages, right? So as opposed to a second language learner where you're really thinking in Spanish, but you're translating in English, right? But when we think in both languages, we may not even realize that we're switching between languages, and that's called code switching. Code mixing is similar. I don't know, I didn't see code switching in this textbook. I did see reference to code, oh, there it is right there, code switching. I was going to say code mixing, but that's when we sort of mix up words. And then another important, and this one actually I think shows up in a quiz question. I don't see, there it is, parentese down here. Did I spell that right? P-A-R-E-N-T-E. Yes, I did. Parentese, or well, what another thing to call it, they often call it, is child-directed speech. Parentese is baby talk. It's a fancy word for how adults talk to babies. And the laboratory or researchers argue that this is a fairly universal thing. What does parentese sound like? And it's almost like we can't help it as adults, that when we talk to babies, we talk slowly. We often talk in a high-pitched voice, right? We enunciate, that we talk differently to babies and children than we do to each other. And again, if Chomsky's theory is correct, right, and this is a phenomenon of your language acquisition device, that would be part of our organic upbringing, or part of our organic programming, is to talk differently, because we are trying to teach our children, the next generation, how to communicate with us, that this is how our species communicates. I'm going to stop right there, and because the next topic is kind of long, and the next topic is emotions, which is when okay, stop, see you in a bit.